Outdoorsman, what's the most terrifying experience you've encountered in the woods? Story 1. I was backpacking with my dog and about 12 miles from the road and trailhead, so pretty far from people, though popular enough that other hikers might be around, though we saw no one all day. At about 2 a.m., my dog started this really low, deep growl and woke me up. I turned on my headlamp and saw his teeth showing, and he was right on top of me. I heard heavy footsteps near the tent. I leashed my dog so he wouldn't tear through the tent, and the footsteps moved further away but kept circling my tent. All my food and toiletries were hung in a tree in a bear bag, nothing in the tent to draw a bear's attention. I clapped my hands. Something is still slowly circling. Not something a moose would do, and a bear might if he wanted food, but I've got nothing and a really big dog with me. I decided to step out of the tent with the leash in one hand and bear spray in the other, yelling, "Hey, bear!" The footsteps stopped. The dog's nose was in the air, telling me to look right, but there was nothing in my headlamp that I could see. I didn't hear anything run off, but it was quiet. I gave it 5 minutes or so, but got back in the tent and it started up again, slowly circling maybe 50 feet from me. Maybe an hour later, I heard the footsteps wander off into the woods. At dawn, I took the dog and the bear spray and started looking for tracks. I found a clear path in the leaves that had been trampled, but still no tracks. The dog's nose is on the ground and I follow his lead and he follows the loop around our campsite. We finally see a few human footprints, not shoe tracks, a regular size, not Bigfoot, bear, human foot. Plus, a human turd and toilet paper. Some a-hole was wandering around the middle of nowhere near the tent and circling my tent for an hour or more, leaving a dump for me to find. People are always a bigger concern to me than wildlife when I'm in the woods. They can do scarier things. Story 2. When I was in my younger years, I and a few friends of mine decided to go camping at a nearby lake. It was a 3 to 4 hour hike, and the nearest house was maybe 3 hours away. We brought some homemade wine, drank the whole night, and ate poorly grilled hot dogs. Life was good. We all shared the tent, so it was crowded in the tent, but we all fell asleep sometime around 2 a.m. At 4, I woke up because I could feel someone running their hand down my forearm. It was not that unlikely that someone would brush up against me since there wasn't really that much space to move around in the crowded tent. But this is the arm that was facing the tent, so someone touched me from outside of the tent. I sat up and was instantly horrified to see that all my friends were sound asleep in the tent with me. I put on my deepest voice and shouted, "Whoever you are, you need to leave." And a manly, low voice responds back to me, "You should pack up your stuff, leave." Not threatening or aggressive, just calmly and in a dead kind of way. By then, all my friends were awake and were just looking at me. No words, just pure horror in their eyes. So I replied, "Okay, we'll go, but you need to leave. Hurry up." When we get out of the tent, this man, who is huge by the way, took the little rowboat that was lying at the bank and got into it. He was just sitting in the middle of the lake, watching us pack up our stuff and trying to get away ASAP. We had to walk around the lake on our way back, and he was just sitting there, watching us. We never went back. This was 17 years ago in a rural Scandinavian country. We have a free-to-roam law, so we weren't trespassing. We knew our way around the small town where we grew up. Everybody knew everybody. There have been no people missing or found, perished, never. There hasn't even been a slaying in generations. We told our parents, who at first tried to calm us down, and they said that we were probably overreacting. But the way he caressed my arm before he told us to go just wasn't normal. When we told them everything and what he said to us, we were told to never go back. We all met up some time ago and the subject came up. We tried to do some digging. There are no houses or cabins anywhere near that area. The lake is just way too small to fish. When he was sitting dead center in his little boat, there were maybe 60 feet to land on all sides. No one else has seen this man before or after. Story 3. One time, I went moose hunting in northern British Columbia, Canada, with my dad. My feet got cold, so I got down from the tree stand to walk around. Not 30 seconds later, my dad, very calmly, says, "Hey, Mike, get back up on the stand." Being a teenager, naturally, I was defiant. 10 seconds go by and I hear, "Mike, get yourself back in this tree stand right now." Now, at this point in my life, I hadn't heard my dad curse, so I figured, hey, maybe I should listen, and I climbed back up the stand. My dad grabbed my face and jerked my head to the right, where I saw an absolute goddamn unit of a silver-tipped grizzly charging down the trail toward where I was standing. Under the 10 seconds, and I could have been chowed depending on how good a shot my dad would have been. Story 4. I have a honey hole about 3 miles deep in the national forest area where I hunt. I usually get dropped off and hike in for a weekend. Hogs, white-tailed deer, black bears, and panthers are all still in the area. I've grown up around it, so there isn't much I haven't already seen out there. But last November, I made the trek back there, set up my hammock, and got ready to camp out for the night so I could hunt from sunup to sundown. I lay down, and maybe around 10 minutes later, I heard the most chilling scream not far off. Bobcats, foxes, and limpkins can all sound like screaming, but this was different. There was something about it that just didn't feel right. I sat up, grabbed my binoculars, and started scanning the edge of the swamp. I caught a glimpse of what looked like the shape of a woman running full speed away from something about 200 yards out. Now, mind you, I'm a good few hours walk from a paved road. Hell, even the serviced dirt road is maybe a little over a mile behind me, and she's going in the clear opposite direction. The only thing out there is the woods and eventually the river. I put down the binoculars and grabbed my rifle so I could use the scope if she was being chased by a bear or a panther. I didn't see a damn thing, absolutely nothing. I rushed it off as something my mind made up. The sun was setting, so I decided to get some rest. I went to sleep clutching my rifle a little tighter than usual then. I woke up the next morning and decided to go check the spot where I thought I saw her running. I found smallish barefoot footprints in the mud. I packed up my stuff quickly and in a hurry. I haven't been back since. And what made this terrifying was that there were only human footprints and nothing else. What could have frightened that woman? If you think that this woman witnessed something truly terrifying, wait until you hear what the other campers witnessed in Story 7. It is completely unexpected. Story 5. My son was 18 months old and strapped to my chest in a carrier. We were on our weekly walk into the woods outside of town around 7 a.m. I was about 2 miles in when I started hearing heavy sounds to my right, maybe 30 yards off, something large moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see any movement. I figured it was a deer or a hog and kept moving, not too concerned until I realized we were being followed. For 20 minutes we continued, my son strapped to my chest, and the whole time the same heavy movement kept at our pace. I let the dog off the leash in case we needed to move quickly. Then our path turned sharply to the right around a bend of trees, and there, standing on the trail 25 yards in front of me, was a full-grown mountain lion. He turned his large body towards me and looked right at me. I froze in fear and in surprise. He made eye contact with me and we stared at each other for a moment. When he turned his head away from me, I started backing up, walking backward. The dog was down the trail behind me and had never seen the lion. I continued walking backward until I was back around the bend and we were out of sight of each other. Then I turned and hauled myself out of there as quickly as I could. It took 20 minutes of moving fast to get out of the woods, all the while listening to something large keeping my pace and not knowing if we were being pursued. Those were the most terrifying 20 minutes I ever had in the woods anywhere. It took me months before I was able to go back in there. Story 6. Backpacking the Maryland-Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail. 4 of us were sleeping under a tarp tied up with a paracord, so we only had protection from the rain. I'm guessing around 2 a.m. I'm woken up by hearing branches breaking and movement nearby. Now, this time of year, the worst it could be is a lone, curious black bear, and they don't really pose any real threat. Now, the sounds started getting closer and more rhythmic. Definitely, something is walking. I turn on my side to see if I can see anything. As the walking gets closer, I start to see movement in the leaves, but nothing is making it. I can perfectly hear a person walking towards us and eventually making their way around our makeshift shelter. I freaked out and lay in complete silence for what felt like an eternity until my friend, lying next to me, finally said, "You heard that too, right?" I nearly jumped out of my sleeping bag, but also confirmed I didn't dream the whole damn thing. I still have no explanation, and I'm still half convinced we just had a collective fever dream. In a non-paranormal sense and way scarier than what I typed above, I was stalked by a mountain lion in the Rockies a few years ago. The unease turns into a full terror when you realize what is happening. Then, fighting every instinct not to run like a mofo is a unique experience. Having that primal feeling that you are prey is terrifying. Story 7. I had a bear approach my tent one night while my girlfriend and I were sleeping during a 7-day through hike. When you're sleeping deep in the woods, it's frequently the case that you hear little sounds that seem like big things, and then you worry a little as to whether or not what you're hearing is a big animal. With this sound on this night, there was absolutely no doubt that what I was hearing was a large animal, and it was coming straight from my tent. All my food was hung in a tree nearby, but he must have smelled us. Not only did he come right up to the tent, but he started to sniff at the edge of it. We could hear him sniffing. At this point, we were still both in our sleeping bags. My girlfriend was petrified solid. I banged on the side of the tent and yelled really loud. The bear ran off into the woods, and a few minutes passed and we heard him clomping through the brush and heading straight back to our tent. Then there was more sniffing, right at the exact corner he had sniffed at before. We yelled again, and off he went again, running back into the woods. By this point, I'd had enough. I grabbed the bear spray, climbed to my feet barefoot and bare with only my headlamp and glasses on. I was asleep with my contacts out. I got out of the tent as quickly as I could, and when I stood up, I immediately saw his eyes in the distance. When you're wearing a headlamp, animal eyes reflect directly back at you, but all you see are two bright spots. I picked up a stick and hurled it in his direction while yelling, and he ran off. This was all on a section of the PCT in Washington. I was deep in the wilderness, but there were other campers at the lake that we were at. Wouldn't you know it? The other campers started cheering for my goofy bare bum. Story 8. I was on a camping trip about a year ago with some of my closest friends. The sun was already coming up and there was this blue early morning light. I was sleeping in a tent on the ground between two trucks. My buddy's tent was next to mine, and in the morning, I heard someone walking up to our campsite from about 30 yards out. I assume it's one of my friends coming back from taking a leak. The footsteps kept approaching directly towards my tent and stopped right outside. Not at the opening of the tent, but in the corner of it behind me and to the right. At that moment, I assumed it was one of my still buzzed friends confusing his tent with mine. Wanting to avoid him actually coming in, I struck the side of the tent, signaling that it was occupied, and said, "Gare?" I got no response, no further footsteps, neither moving around the tent nor away from it, no speaking, no sound, nothing. I listened and I waited and didn't hear anything further whatsoever. All three of the people I was camping with had slept in a truck-mounted tent and assured me that they had not walked up to my tent at any point in the morning. My buddy that I had called out to had found his tent to be uncomfortable in the middle of the night, and he went up in the truck-mounted tent with my two other friends. I was the only one on the ground in the morning, and I still have absolutely no explanation for that experience. The creepiest part about that was whatever was making that sound seemed to have just suddenly vanished into thin air. If you're into creepy threads like this, please do hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Story 9. I don't know if anyone will read this, but here it goes. We have a cabin out in the woods by a lake up north in Maine. You have to drive on logging roads to get there. It's about 20 minutes from the small town with no reception. I was out front one night looking at the lake when I noticed something weird traveling along the edge of the woods shoring the lake. It seemed like a lone firefly bobbing along the edge to my right toward the dock. The problem was that there were no fireflies and this one was blue. It was moving at a consistent pace with the same bobbing pattern. I was feeling freaked out when I noticed it got to the dock and changed directions towards me. I turned back inside and closed the glass wood door. Now that night, we were all in bed and I was in the dining room on the pull-out couch. The front door is in clear view and we have a huge double set of windows to my left with a clear view of the room. The only sound was wind coming from off of the lake, but these windows are facing the woods opposite. So I was on my iPad when I heard what sounded like the weight of something large slowly pressing itself against the windows. Everything was pitch black and I turned off the iPad and just lay there, frozen in terror for a good 10 or 15 minutes, just wondering if it was someone or something staring into the cabin room, maybe at me. I felt like I heard the weight being relieved from the windows, no other noise was made. I chalked it up to heavy wind, but that sure as hell didn't sound like wind to me. I never felt more terrified in my life. Story 10. I went on a kayak camping trip in East Texas, found a little spot where we could get our kayaks up the bank to camp. We were eating around the fire at night and heard a loud splash like a tree branch falling into the water where we pulled up our kayaks. We hear it again and walk over to check it out. I hear it again and then nothing, then water just swishing around. I realized what it was and I turned and ran a few seconds before my friends did. It was a gator slapping its tail to tell us how big he was. We never saw it. We built that fire up as big as possible and slept very poorly that night. The next morning, we realized the little break in the bank and quote-unquote trail we followed was a gator slide and we were camping in the gator nest. My tent was literally in the nest. Luckily, it wasn't mating season and there were no eggs there or we might have made friends with that gator. Story 11. I work in the bush and sometimes spend months out there. The most terrifying was seeing a bear start to circle me right as the helicopter pilot radioed me to say he couldn't get to my location because of the weather. Luckily, I had a shotgun with me and eventually the pilot got down to me. But yeah, sitting there in the sleet while watching that grizzly slowly and sneakily try to cut around my position in the fading light was absolutely terrifying. The whole time I was trying to come up with possible ways to keep from being outflanked and to keep visual contact with it in case I had to shoot it. This was in the late fall, so the bear probably hadn't put on enough fat for the year and he was looking to supplement it. Spooky stuff. Story 12. Not in the woods, but my grandparents, back in the Philippines, they had a 150-acre mango tree farm. Me and my two cousins were having our afternoon snack by the backyard balcony when suddenly all the usual sounds we normally hear stopped. No wind, no birds were chirping, no usual insects or critter noises. It was like time had stopped for no reason. Then in one of the trees, we saw this saran wrap-looking thing reaching from one branch to another, then to another tree. It was a see-through thing that we just couldn't make out. One of my cousins ran inside the house and called my uncle and my grandpa and told them what we saw. My uncle grabbed the dry tail of a stingray and started hitting the wooden rail of the balcony, yelling out whatever we saw. He didn't see it though, and from that point forward, we were forbidden from hanging out in the backyard without an adult present. This was in 1987. We'll never forget what we saw. Now this one reminds me of the cloaking powers of the predator. Story 13. I grew up in a very wooded area in my younger years. One night, I was just lying in bed. Outside of my window, I heard this whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It sounded like two giant wings flapping right outside my window. Luckily for me, I had the window covered because I very much don't like the thought of something looking at me when I can't see it. But I still lay in bed terrified at what was occurring, and after hearing the wings flap about 5 to 7 times, it finally went away. It took about a full second for the wings to do each flap, and I could hear it so loud. I still have no explanation for what could have been that large and wanted to basically just hang around at the side of the house after midnight. Story 14. I was on a walk with a friend of mine, and it had rained the day before, so the dirt trail we were on had been wiped clean of previous tracks and turned into fairly firm mud by the time we got to it. Again, there were no tracks on the trail when we were heading uphill, and we eventually stumbled across a cave and decided to take a peek inside. It only took a few moments of snooping around to notice that there were many bones lying around the floor and a distinct stench of cat whiz. We decided it was in our best interest to get the hell out of there and started heading down the trail to the car with our heads on a swivel. Partway down the trail, I noticed some very large cat prints in the mud just behind our footprints. I never saw that mountain lion, but it sure saw us. Man, I hate stalkers, whether animals or humans. Story 15. Calico, California. It's a desert ghost town and an abandoned mine. We were winter camping with the Boy Scouts and the weather took a turn. It went from the 70s to the teens within like 20 minutes. Then came the sleet. We abandoned our tents and holed up in the one permanent structure in the area, the bathroom. The wind picked up from a breeze to sustain 60 miles per hour and we could hear our gear just getting taken away. Now the thing about Calico is that it's an abandoned silver mine. The mountain has dozens of mapped and unmapped mine tunnels. For lack of a better word, the mountain wails and moans. The stronger the wind, the worse the sounds, and I've never been more terrified in my life. I'm not superstitious, but it literally sounded like someone opened up the Ark of the Covenant right outside. Story 16. Our house is in the woods, and in the summer of 2020, we were expected to have a pretty bad thunderstorm. I was in the middle of cooking, so I asked my husband to take the dogs outside. About a minute later, my husband and my dogs come running in. My husband yells, "We need to get to the basement, now." And as soon as he says that, the power goes out. We run to the basement and I hear what sounds like a freight train and bombs going off above us. The freight train sound was the sound of the derecho, hurricane-force winds in landlocked areas, and the bomb sounds were 200-plus-year-old trees falling all around us. We were very lucky. We weren't hurt. Yesterday, we just completed the restoration of our home and the fencing. Story 17. Walking out in the pitch black to a deer stand, it was so dark that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I heard something large circling around me. It was trotting along. No big deal, I figured. It was just a deer. Then it stopped and let out the most bone-chilling howl I have ever heard in my life. It was so loud, it was like it was inside of me. A few wolves howled back in the distance and it ran off. I needed new underwear, if you get my drift. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy Hikers. What's the scariest thing you saw in the forest? You'd be surprised with the turn of events in story 4. I'll see you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.